We're not paying for her," my daughter-in-law told the waiter, pointing across the table at my daughter as if Emily were a stranger who had wandered in from the street. For one long second, nobody moved. My grandson Owen stared at his plate. My son Daniel studied the wine in his glass. And Emily's face went still in the way people's faces do when humiliation lands too deep for an immediate reaction. I looked at the $34 salmon in front of her, then at the $260 bottle of Cabernet Marissa had ordered without checking the price. "That's fine," I told the waiter. "Put Emily's meal with mine. Daniel and Marissa can pay for everything else." Marissa smiled instead of protesting. "You don't need to make a scene, Rick," she said. "Our part is already going on the family account." That was the moment I realized she knew about an account I believed had been closed 3 years earlier. And the bill that arrived 20 minutes later told me this dinner had never really been about a piece of salmon. My name is Richard Lawson, though everyone who knows me calls me Rick. I was 70 years old that spring. A vidover, a father of 2, and the retired founder of a commercial maintenance company I had built from one dented pickup truck and a second-hand floor buffer. Before I tell you how a family dinner turned into the first crack in everything I thought I understood, remember this: the people who take advantage of you rarely begin by asking for everything. They begin by asking for something small enough that saying no makes you look unreasonable. My wife, Linda, had been gone 8 years by then, and after losing her, I made the mistake many lonely fathers make. I tried to keep everyone close by making life easier for them. I paid for vacations, tuition deposits, emergency repairs, medical bills, and more restaurant checks than I could count. I told myself generosity was love. In truth, sometimes it was simply my way of avoiding the arguments Linda had once been brave enough to have. That Saturday had started quietly at my brick ranch house in Worthington, just north of Columbus. Emily was at the kitchen counter correcting student essays while I struggled through the exercises my physical therapist had given me after knee replacement surgery. She was 44, a school counselor with a dry sense of humor and the patience of someone who spent her days listening to teenagers explain why consequences should not apply to them. 3 months earlier, an electrical fire had damaged her apartment building. Nobody was hurt, but smoke and water ruined most of what she owned. So she moved into my guest room while the insurance company dragged its feet. She also drove me to therapy, organized my prescriptions, and made sure I did not pretend I could climb ladders before my surgeon cleared me. "Owen's dinner is at 6:30, she reminded me. "And before you ask, yes, I'm going." He called twice to make sure. I told her Marissa had invited her. But Emily's expression said we both knew invitation and welcome were not always the same thing. Owen was Daniel and Marissa's only child, 17 years old and recently accepted to Ohio State University. He was a thoughtful boy who had inherited Daniel's height and none of his father's appetite for status. Emily had spent months helping him polish his application essay, not because anyone asked her to, but because Owen trusted her. The dinner at Riverstone Grill was supposed to celebrate him. Daniel had reserved a private room and described it as just immediate family. Though Marissa later invited her business partner and another couple from their neighborhood, that was typical. Events grew whenever Marissa sensed an audience worth impressing. She ran a boutique event planning company called Marlowe and Pine, and she had a gift for making ordinary spaces look expensive. Unfortunately, she had also begun believing anything expensive must be important. Their house was larger than they needed. Their cars were leased, and their family photographs always seemed to include a new kitchen, resort, or designer label. Daniel used to laugh at that kind of performance. In recent years, he had started arranging himself inside it. Daniel was 42 and had worked beside me since he graduated from college. When I sold the operating side of Lawson Commercial Services, I kept 4 retail properties under Lawson Property Group LLC. The buildings brought in steady rent, and Daniel managed repairs, tenant relationships, and vendor contracts. I owned 80% of the company. Daniel and Emily each owned 10. An arrangement Linda and I had created so both children would share in what we built. Daniel received a salary in addition to his ownership interest, and I gave him broad authority because I believed responsibility would make him feel trusted. 2 years earlier, before a different surgery, I had signed a financial power of attorney naming him as my agent. I meant to revoke it after I recovered, but I never did. That omission did not concern me then. Daniel was my son. I had changed his diapers, coached his Little League team, paid for his education, and handed him keys to offices I once cleaned at midnight. Trusting him felt less like a decision than breathing. The tension between Emily and Marissa had never been dramatic enough to force a reckoning. It lived in small remarks that could be dismissed as misunderstandings. Marissa called Emily's apartment temporary living even before the fire. She joked that school employees collected pensions for working bankers' hours. When Emily helped Owen with his essay, Marissa thanked her by saying, "It's nice you have so much free time." I usually changed the subject. I told myself grown women should resolve their own disagreements. But that was not neutrality. Silence almost always protects the person willing to be cruelest. Before we left for the restaurant, Emily stood in the hallway wearing a navy dress Linda had given her years earlier. She asked whether she should take her own car. "Ride with me," I said. She hesitated, then picked up her coat. I understood the hesitation only later. She already expected to be treated like an outsider and did not want me trapped between defending her and preserving the evening. I had spent years teaching her that family peace mattered more than her discomfort. Riverstone Grill sat along the Scioto River in a renovated stone mill with tall windows, polished oak floors, and waiters who could describe butter as if it had attended graduate school. Daniel met us near the hostess stand. He hugged me carefully because of my knee, then gave Emily a quick one-armed embrace. "Glad you made it," he said, though his eyes moved toward the door as if he expected someone more important. Marissa was already seated in the private room, wearing cream-colored silk and directing a young waiter named Tyler where to place the wine buckets. "Rick, you're here," she said brightly. To Emily, she offered only, "There's a seat near the end." Owen stood, walked around the table, and hugged his aunt properly. "You came," he whispered. "Of course I came," Emily said. I saw Marissa watch them, and something tightened around her smile. Later, I would understand that even affection had become a resource in that family. Something counted, compared, and guarded. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Owen talked about studying environmental engineering, and I told him that sounded more useful than anything I had studied at his age, which was mostly how to repair equipment without reading instructions. Everyone laughed. Marissa ordered appetizers for the table, then 2 bottles of Cabernet, after announcing the first wine selection was too ordinary for a milestone. Emily ordered salmon, skipped alcohol, and asked Owen about the scholarship application due the following week. "We've got that handled," Marissa interrupted. Owen looked down. "Aunt Emily helped me outline it," he said. Marissa took a careful sip of wine. "Yes, Emily loves being useful." The words were harmless on paper, but her tone turned usefulness into desperation. Daniel heard it. So did I. He rubbed the stem of his glass and said nothing. I asked Owen about campus housing, steering the conversation away again, repeating the same cowardly habit I had mistaken for diplomacy. Emily answered questions when spoken to, and otherwise kept her attention on her nephew. The trouble started when Tyler returned near dessert and quietly asked Daniel whether the bill should remain on one check. Marissa answered before my son could speak. "Separate Emily's," she said. Tyler glanced at Emily, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Marissa pointed toward her with 2 fingers. "We're not paying for her." The room became so quiet I heard ice shift inside a water glass. Emily set down her fork. "I can pay for myself," she said, her voice level but pale. Marissa leaned back. "Good. It's time everyone did," Owen whispered. "Mom." But Daniel placed a hand on his son's arm as though the boy were the one causing embarrassment. I waited for Daniel to defend his sister. Instead, he turned to me. "Dad, don't overreact. Marissa's trying to establish some boundaries." I looked at the loaded table, the wine, the untouched appetizers, and the guests Marissa had invited. Apparently boundaries were only necessary when the person being excluded could not improve her image. I asked Tyler to place Emily's meal on my check and everything else on Daniel and Marissa's. I did not raise my voice. Years of negotiating contracts had taught me that calmness often unsettles people more than anger. Marissa's mouth curved into a small, satisfied smile. "Our part goes on the Lawson family account." she said. Daniel already arranged it. I turned to my son. What family account? Daniel blinked once, then reached for his glass. It's the corporate hospitality account. We use it for tenant and client events. This is Owen's celebration, I said. Not a tenant event. He lowered his voice. Several people here are business contacts. We can discuss classifications Monday. Marissa gave Tyler a reassuring nod, as though she and I had merely disagreed over seating. Just process it the usual way, she said. The usual way. Those 3 words stayed with me because I had not hosted a business dinner at Riverstone since selling the service company 3 years earlier. When dessert arrived, nobody wanted it. Owen pushed a spoon through his chocolate cake without taking a bite. Emily excused herself to the restroom, and I followed a minute later, finding her near the coat room instead. I'm sorry, I said. She gave a tired smile. You didn't say it. I let her get comfortable saying things like it. That landed between us with more honesty than either of us expected. Emily folded her arms, not defensively, but as if holding herself together. Dad, I don't care about the meal. I care that Daniel sat there. I told her I cared too, though part of me was still resisting the obvious. Daniel had always been eager to avoid conflict. I wanted to believe his silence was weakness, not agreement. Emily looked back toward the private room. Marissa knew you would pay, she said. That's why she could humiliate me without risking anything. I started to deny it, then realized she was right. Marissa had turned my generosity into a weapon because experience told her I would cover the damage and call it peace. Tyler returned with a leather folder for me and another for Daniel. Before he could set them down, the restaurant manager entered. I recognized him after a moment as Nathan Cole, who had handled corporate events for us years earlier. He shook my hand warmly, asked about my knee, then looked uncomfortable. Mr. Lawson, may I speak with you privately? Daniel immediately said. I handle company accounts now. Nathan glanced between us. I understand. But Mr. Lawson is still listed as the primary guarantor. That word changed the air. We stepped into the hallway. Nathan carried a thicker folder than the one Tyler had brought. He explained that Riverstone's accounting office had tried to reach Daniel several times about an overdue balance attached to Lawson Property Group. Payments had been made intermittently, keeping the account open, but the remaining charges had accumulated. How much? I asked. Nathan opened the folder and turned the statement toward me. The number at the bottom was $18,426. I read the itemized pages slowly. 7 events over 14 months. A birthday dinner matching Marissa's date of birth. A Marlowe and Pine launch reception. Daniel and Marissa's anniversary meal. A holiday cocktail event with no tenant names listed. Every charge had been labeled client development or tenant relations. Each bore Daniel's electronic approval. Tonight's dinner had already been added, including the wine, Marissa's guests, and the private room fee. Only Emily's $34 entree had been excluded. Nathan watched my face carefully. I assumed you knew, he said. Mr. Daniel Lawson always said the expenses were authorized under the company's hospitality program. I photographed every page with my phone. My hands did not shake, though something inside me had begun to separate into clean, cold pieces. Do not charge tonight to that account, I said. I'll pay for myself and my daughter personally. Daniel can decide how to handle the rest. Nathan nodded, then hesitated before removing one additional sheet from the folder. It was a reservation confirmation for 3 weeks later. The private room had been booked for 24 guests under the title Lawson Leadership Transition Dinner. The contact was Daniel. The deposit had been charged to Lawson Property Group, and the notes requested a projector, a podium, and a printed sign reading The Next Generation. I looked at the date twice. No leadership transition had been discussed with me. No board meeting had been scheduled, and no authority had been given to announce one. Through the open doorway, I could see Daniel leaning toward Marissa, speaking urgently while she watched the hallway. He looked less like a son worried about his father, and more like a manager waiting to learn whether an audit had begun. I folded the reservation behind the account statement, paid for Emily and myself, and walked back to the table. Dad, Daniel said, we should talk. I put on my coat. We will, I told him, But not until I know what you've already been telling everyone else. The ride home from Riverstone took less than 20 minutes. But it felt longer because Emily and I spent most of it in silence. The restaurant statement lay folded inside my coat pocket like something warm enough to burn through the fabric. When we stopped at a red light, Emily finally said, "Daniel knew." I kept my eyes on the traffic. "He approved the charges." "That isn't what I meant." Her voice was quiet. "He knew Marissa was going to do that to me. And he let her." I had no answer worth giving. The $18,000 bothered me because it was evidence. But Daniel's silence at the table hurt in a different way. Money could be traced, explained, or repaid. A brother watching his sister be humiliated required a choice. And my son had made his. When we reached the house, Emily went straight upstairs. I sat alone at the kitchen table and placed the restaurant statement beside Linda's old ceramic sugar bowl, wondering how many family injuries I had covered with a check and called forgiveness. By 7 the next morning, my phone had become a courtroom. Marissa sent a message to the family group saying the celebration had been ruined by unnecessary hostility. Daniel followed with a longer explanation claiming I had embarrassed Owen, insulted, invited guests, and abandoned the family with an unexpected bill. A cousin in Cincinnati wrote that everyone should calm down. My sister asked whether I had taken my medication. Emily read the messages over my shoulder and laughed once. Without humor. She told a waiter I wasn't worth $34. And somehow you're the villain. Before I could answer, Daniel called. He did not ask how I was feeling or whether Emily was all right. "Dad, we need to get ahead of this," he said. Get ahead of what? The misunderstanding. Marissa's wording was bad. But you turned it into a public confrontation. I reminded him that I had paid my bill and left quietly. He sighed as though patience with me had become an exhausting duty. That's not how everyone at the table experienced it. I asked him directly about the Riverstone account. Daniel shifted into the measured tone he used with difficult tenants. He said every charge was connected to business development, even if the setting appeared social. Marissa's birthday dinner had included a leasing broker. Their anniversary dinner involved a contractor. The Marlowe and Pine launch had allowed Lawson Property Group to meet prospective vendors. You can't classify personal events as business expenses because someone in the room owns a briefcase, I said. Daniel told me I was oversimplifying modern relationship management. Then I asked about the leadership transition dinner. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. He claimed we had discussed introducing him as the new public face of the company once I reduced my workload. We discussed you taking more vendor meetings, I said. We never discussed a transition. Daniel lowered his voice. Dad, you may not remember every conversation lately. The sentence was delivered gently, almost lovingly, but it landed harder than Marissa's insult. It was not an explanation. It was a warning about the story he intended to tell. Marissa arrived before noon carrying a cardboard tray with 3 coffees. As though beverages could transform an invasion into concern. She placed one in front of me, ignored Emily's cup entirely, and sat without being invited. I'm sorry last night got ugly, she began. Emily stood near the sink. You made it ugly. Marissa looked at her with practiced sadness. This is exactly the defensiveness I'm talking about. She turned to me and said Emily's presence in my house had created tension, confusion, and dependence. According to her, I had become suspicious only after Emily moved in. She should find somewhere else to stay. Marissa said, for your own peace. I watched my daughter's face close again. And for once, I did not change the subject. Emily lives here until she decides she is ready to leave. Marissa's expression sharpened. Rick, this isn't about choosing sides. You chose sides in front of a waiter. She rose, leaving the untouched coffees behind. At the door, she said, people are worried about your judgment. Then she walked out before I could ask which people she had already recruited. I called Susan Patel, my accountant. Immediately after Marissa left, Susan had worked with me for 19 years and possessed the rare ability to make suspicions sound like arithmetic. I told her I needed a review of every payment from Lawson Property Group to Marlowe and Pine events, along with all Riverstone charges, credit card statements, and vendor approvals signed by Daniel. She did not ask whether I trusted my son. She only asked how far back to look. 2 years, I said. And don't notify Daniel yet. Susan paused, then told me Daniel had recently requested expanded access to archived accounting files. He claimed he was preparing succession materials for lenders. That phrase tightened something in my chest. Succession had appeared twice in less than 12 hours. Once on a restaurant reservation and now in my own accounting system. Susan promised to call when she had enough to show me. I also asked her to suspend the corporate card connected to Riverstone and place a temporary hold on new payments to Marlowe and Pine. Daniel will know quickly, she warned. I'm counting on it, I said. He knew within 40 minutes. Daniel called from his office, angry enough to forget his careful tone. A maintenance vendor had tried to purchase materials and discovered one company card was frozen. I told him the operating account remained open and legitimate expenses could be paid by invoice. You're interfering with daily operations because Marissa hurt Emily's feelings, he said. I'm reviewing $18,000 in overdue restaurant charges. Those were authorized. By whom? By me. I manage the company. I reminded him that managing did not mean owning, and ownership did not excuse self-dealing. He accused me of humiliating him in front of employees and putting tenant relationships at risk. Then his anger cooled too suddenly. Have you taken your pain medication today? He asked. I looked at the bottle on the counter. I had not needed prescription medication in weeks. Why would that matter? Because you get agitated when your schedule changes. I understood then that every response I gave could be collected, labeled, and retold. I stopped defending myself. Send all vendor concerns to Susan, I said, and ended the call while Daniel was still speaking. That afternoon, Emily found me in the garage sorting old company files I had stored in metal cabinets. She leaned against the workbench and asked whether I remembered leaving my keys in the refrigerator after surgery. I did. I had been taking oxycodone, reached for a cold bottle of water, and set the keys on a shelf without thinking. Daniel had laughed and taken a photograph. Emily reminded me of the afternoon I missed physical therapy because the clinic changed the appointment time, and the Thanksgiving when I called Owen by Daniel's name. Daniel asked me about all three, she said. 2 weeks earlier, he had called her and asked whether I had ever gotten lost while driving, forgotten to pay utilities, left the stove on, or accused people of stealing. When she denied it, he told her not to protect me out of guilt. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. She looked ashamed. Because I thought he was scared. And because you always say Daniel worries differently than I do. She was right. I had spent years translating my son's behavior into kinder language than his actions deserved. Susan called the following morning and asked me to come to her office without Daniel. She had arranged printed spreadsheets across a conference table, each row highlighted by category. In 14 months, Lawson Property Group had paid Marlowe and Pine $93,600 through 8 separate invoices. None exceeded $25,000. The threshold above which Daniel needed my written approval. The descriptions sounded legitimate until Susan placed them beside supporting records that did not exist. Tenant appreciation activation, she read, pointing to an invoice for $12,400. There was no guest list. Venue contract, catering receipt, tenant, correspondance, or photograph. Another invoice for succession communication strategy totaled $18,900 and contained only a 3-page proposal filled with language that said almost nothing. Could these services have been provided? I asked. Possibly, Susan said. But Daniel approved payment to his wife's company without disclosing competitive bids or documenting deliverables. At minimum, that is a serious conflict. At worst, these invoices were designed to move money. She showed me the payment dates next. 2 transfers to Marlowe and Pine occurred days before Daniel and Marissa paid overdue property taxes on their house. Another landed before a large business loan payment. Susan was careful not to claim the money had been traced directly from my company to those debts. But the timing created a pattern too neat to ignore. I asked why she had not flagged it earlier. Her face tightened. Daniel told me you approved Marlowe and Pine as a preferred vendor during your recovery. He also sent a copy of the financial power of attorney. The document gave him authority to handle certain obligations while I was incapacitated. But I had recovered long before most of the payments. I had never written an expiration date into it. That was my mistake. And admitting it did not lessen Daniel's responsibility. I told Susan to preserve every record. including emails and access logs. Do not accuse him yet, I said. I want to know whether we're looking at panic, greed, or something planned. Susan glanced at the spreadsheets. Those possibilities can overlap. By Thursday, the financial problem had started damaging more than my balance sheet. A roofing contractor called me directly and asked whether Daniel had become the sole decision-maker. One of our retail tenants had received an email saying all major communications should now go through Daniel because I was reducing involvement for health reasons. I had authorized no such announcement. When I confronted Daniel by email, he replied that he was protecting continuity and avoiding confusion. He copied 2 property managers, transforming a private disagreement into a public record of his supposed competence and my supposed instability. That evening, Marissa posted a message online about how difficult it was to protect an aging parent when another family member encourages fear and isolation. She named nobody, but several relatives contacted Emily. One asked whether she was pressuring me to change my will. Another suggested she find her own apartment so Daniel could manage the situation responsibly. Emily sat at the kitchen table reading the messages until her eyes reddened. They're making me the reason, she said. No, I told her. They're making you the cover. I contacted Dr. Hélène Mercer, a geriatric specialist who had never treated me and had no relationship with my family. I explained that I wanted a complete cognitive and decision-making assessment. Her office scheduled 2 appointments, one for medical history and testing, and another for financial capacity evaluation. I told no one except Emily and Susan. The decision embarrassed me more than I expected. I had negotiated 7-figure property sales without trembling. Yet I felt exposed answering questions about memory, dates, medications, and household routines. Dr. Mercer noticed my discomfort. Competent people often resent having to prove competence, she said, but the purpose is not to reward pride. It is to create an objective record. I completed number sequences, recalled words, explained my ownership structure, calculated percentages, and described what would happen if a tenant defaulted. When she asked why I was seeking evaluation, I said, because my son has started asking whether I remember conversations we never had. She did not react dramatically. She simply wrote the sentence down, which made it feel more serious. While I was completing the second appointment, Susan examined the access logs on the company's cloud server. She called me afterward and said she had found a restricted folder created under Daniel's credentials. Its name was Senior Transition. She could see file titles and metadata but wanted legal guidance before opening everything because some documents might contain private medical information. The visible list included photographs of prescription labels, a calendar of my medical appointments, a document titled Memory Incidents, and a video file recorded the day of my knee surgery. I remembered that video. Daniel had stood beside my hospital bed while I was waking from anesthesia and asked me who the president was. I gave the wrong name, then laughed because I barely knew where I was. At the time, he said he was making a funny clip for Owen. Now the file sat in a folder beside my medications and financial records. When was the folder created? I asked. Susan hesitated. 6 months ago. Emily had moved into my house only 3 months earlier. Whatever Daniel was preparing, he had begun before she could be blamed for it. I met with Martin Keene the next morning. Martin had drafted the LLC agreement when Linda was still alive and had handled my estate plan after her death. He read the restaurant statement, studied Susan's summary, and examined the copy of my power of attorney. First, we revoke this, he said. Second, we notify every financial institution in writing. Third, you stop speaking casually around Daniel about your health, your will, or company control. I asked whether Daniel could take over Lawson Property Group without my approval. Martin said no, not while I remained competent and held 80% of the ownership. Then he tapped the words Senior Transition on Susan's report. But if a court declared you incapacitated, a guardian or conservator could exercise your rights. Daniel would argue he is the natural choice because he already manages the business. I looked out the window at the courthouse across the street. Would a forgotten appointment be enough? No. But a pattern. Witnesses, medical records, financial confusion, and public outbursts could create an argument. Suddenly, the dinner at Riverstone looked less like cruelty and more like staging. Martin prepared the revocation. But before we sent it, Susan asked permission to preserve the folder contents. Working with Martin, she copied the metadata and opened only business-related documents stored on the company server. One was an invoice from a consulting firm specializing in family guardianship preparation and elder transitions. Lawson Property Group had paid the firm $6,800 under the description management continuity. Another document was a checklist, medication history, examples of confusion, witness statements, financial irregularities, unsafe decisions, and resistance to assistance. Beside witness statements, Daniel had tupid Marissa, staff, restaurant personnel, possibly Owen. The last name stopped me. My grandson had been invited to his own celebration while his parents prepared to use the evening as evidence against me. I did not yet know whether they planned to provoke an argument or simply observe one. But Daniel's email about my health, Marissa's accusation, and the frozen expression on his face at the table formed a pattern. They were not reacting to my behavior. They were arranging a version of it. That evening, I sat with Emily on the back porch while rain ticked against the gutters. I told her about the folder, the consulting invoice, and Martin's warning. She covered her mouth, then asked the question I had been avoiding. "Do you think Daniel wants your money?" I looked across the dark yard where I had once built a swing set for both my children. "I think he wants control. Money is part of control, but it may not be the whole of it." Emily reminded me that Daniel had always feared being replaced. As a boy, he panicked when coaches benched him. As an adult, he treated every disagreement as a referendum on whether I trusted him. I had responded by giving him more responsibility, more authority, and fewer limits. I thought confidence would come after trust. I said, "Maybe entitlement came first." Emily reached for my hand. "What are you going to do?" I watched rain collect on the railing. "Nothing loud," I said. "That's what they're waiting for." Before going to bed, I checked my email one last time. A message from Susan had arrived with an attachment she had recovered from the deleted items archive. It was a draft agenda for the leadership transition dinner. Daniel was listed as incoming president of Lawson Property Group. Marissa was scheduled to speak about protecting family legacy through decisive stewardship. My name appeared at the end beside a 5-minute segment titled Founder's Remarks, followed by the note, "Keep brief, he may become confused." Below the agenda was a second document, more troubling than the first. It was an unfinished petition seeking emergency guardianship over me, already filled with my address, assets, medications, and alleged incidents of memory loss. The creation date was 6 months earlier. The restaurant dinner had not caused Daniel to question my competence. He had been building the case long before Marissa pointed at Emily, long before the bill arrived, and perhaps long before I noticed anything at all. The unfinished guardianship petition stayed open on my laptop until nearly 2 in the morning. I read each allegation twice, not because I doubted what the words said, but because part of me still expected them to rearrange into something less deliberate. Daniel had listed my forgotten keys, the missed therapy appointment, and the anesthesia video as evidence of progressive decline. He described my decision to suspend the company card as financially erratic behavior, and Emily's presence in my home as increasing isolation from trusted relatives. The language was polished, cautious, and merciless. Nothing looked like a lie when separated from context. That was what made it effective. Daniel had taken ordinary moments, stripped away the circumstances, and lined them up until they resembled a diagnosis. I had spent my life believing truth would defend itself if a man kept good records and acted honorably. Sitting there in the dark, I understood that facts did not defend themselves. They needed someone willing to preserve context before another person weaponized the fragments. The next morning, Martin met me at Susan's office with a yellow legal pad and the expression he reserved for bad situations that were still manageable. He examined the draft petition, then asked Susan to display the folder's creation history. The senior transition folder had been created 6 months earlier, but several files were added over time. Daniel had uploaded the anesthesia video first, then the medication photographs, then a document called Observed Incidents. 2 months later, he added the guardianship consultant's checklist. The restaurant reservation appeared only 3 weeks ago. This matters, Martin said. It shows planning. But planning alone does not prove bad faith. Daniel will say he was preparing responsibly for a parent's decline. Susan opened another recovered email thread. The subject line was Owen dinner seating. Daniel had sent it to Marissa 4 days before Riverstone. Put Emily near Dad. He wrote, if she starts defending him, let her. Don't smooth anything over. A later message from Marissa asked, how far do you want me to push? Daniel answered, enough that someone outside the family notices. Emily was sitting beside me when Susan read that line aloud. She went completely still. I felt something inside me harden, but not into anger. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was recognition. Marissa had not chosen the restaurant insult at random. She had been instructed to create tension, and Daniel expected me to react. The waiter, the manager, the guests. Even Owen had been positioned as potential witnesses. We're not paying for her was not only cruelty toward Emily, it was bait for me. Had I shouted, threatened to cut Daniel off, or stormed out without paying, the scene would have fit neatly into the petition. Marissa's exclusion of one inexpensive meal had been designed to provoke a disproportionate response. Instead, the hidden account surfaced. Their plan had failed in one way and exposed them in another. Emily looked at me and whispered, he used me to get to you. I nodded, and he used Owen's celebration to do it. That was the moment the entire dinner changed shape in my mind. Martin warned us not to assume Marissa was merely following orders. The emails showed participation, not innocence. Still, they shifted the center of responsibility. For months, I had treated Marissa as the source of Daniel's worst behavior, the ambitious spouse who had pulled my son toward appearances and debt. That explanation had been comforting because it preserved an older version of Daniel in my memory. The boy who carried my toolbox, the young man who stayed late to help me finish bids, the son who gave the eulogy at Linda's funeral because I could not get through the first paragraph. Blaming Marissa allowed me to believe that boy remained intact beneath her influence. The emails removed that refuge. Daniel had chosen the timing, the witnesses, and the pressure point. Marissa had joined him because her business was failing, and because she resented Emily. But Daniel had designed the machinery. I could no longer pretend he was being manipulated. He was managing the manipulation, and I had trained him well enough to know how. Susan's forensic review uncovered the pressure behind Marissa's cooperation. Marlowe and Pine owed roughly $310,000 across a bank line. Equipment financing, unpaid subcontractors, and taxes. The company's revenue had fallen after 2 major clients canceled annual events. Yet Marissa continued leasing a downtown studio and employing 5 people. The payments from Lawson Property Group had kept her business alive. Daniel had approved them in amounts just below his authorization limit, often within days of Marlowe and Pine's debt payments. Susan could not yet prove every dollar went directly toward those obligations. But the timing was consistent. She may have convinced herself the contracts were legitimate. Susan said, people under pressure become very creative about definitions. I remembered Marissa's constant insistence that appearances were part of business. To her, the launch parties, wine dinners, and polished photographs probably felt like investments rather than theft. Understanding her fear did not excuse her. It only explained why she had accepted Daniel's promise that once he controlled Lawson Property Group, her company would receive permanent work. Martin found the promise in another deleted thread. Daniel had written, once the transition is formal, I can lock in Marlowe and Pine for tenant events, openings, holiday programs, and communications. We won't have to keep asking him. Marissa replied, I need certainty before fall. Daniel answered, you'll have it. There was no discussion of competitive bidding, performance measures, or whether the properties needed those services. The company was being positioned as a private pipeline to stabilize their household. Daniel's motive was no longer difficult to understand. He feared losing status, feared admitting the lifestyle he and Marissa displayed was financed by debt, and feared that I might replace him if I learned how poorly he had managed both business and family. Rather than confess the problem, he decided I was the obstacle. If I became legally incompetent, he would not have to ask my permission, explain the invoices, or risk being removed. He could call the takeover protection and expect the family to applaud his sacrifice. The hardest part was admitting how much room I had given him. I had allowed Daniel to approve vendors, review expenses, and communicate with lenders without meaningful oversight. When Emily once suggested separating purchasing from payment approval, I told her Daniel would hear it as distrust. When Susan recommended annual conflict of interest disclosures, I said formalities were unnecessary between family members. I had mistaken informality for loyalty. Worse, I had created different kinds of secrecy with both children. When Emily struggled after her divorce, I quietly helped with legal fees and rent because I did not want Daniel accusing her of dependence. When Daniel wanted authority, I gave him titles and access without telling Emily how much control he held. Each child received something in private, then guessed what the other had been given. Linda used to say secrets grow teeth. After she died, I kept too many arrangements hidden because explaining them felt uncomfortable. Daniel's betrayal was his choice, but the system he exploited had been built from my avoidance. That evening, I asked Emily to sit with me in the living room. Linda's photograph stood on the mantel, taken during our 30th anniversary trip to Maine. I told Emily I owed her an apology. She tried to interrupt, but I asked her to let me finish. I kept telling you to be the bigger person because you were the safer person to disappoint. I said, I knew you would stay. I wasn't protecting the family. I was protecting myself from conflict. Emily's eyes filled, but she did not look away. I admitted that every time Marissa made a cutting remark and I changed the subject, I taught her the behavior had no cost. Every time Daniel avoided defending his sister, and I excused him as conflict-averse, I made his silence respectable. Emily took a long breath. I didn't need you to pick me over him, she said. I needed you to notice when he was already picking himself. That sentence hurt because it was precise. I promised I would not hide behind peace again. Even if truth cost us the version of family I had been protecting, the medical evaluation became our first objective defense. Dr. Mercer's report was thorough, not flattering. She noted normal age-related lapses, reduced sleep after surgery, and temporary confusion associated with prescribed pain medication. She also documented intact executive function, memory, financial reasoning, judgment, and understanding of consequences. During the capacity portion, she asked me to explain Lawson Property Group's ownership structure, debt obligations, lease terms, and what would happen if I transferred my voting rights. I answered without difficulty. She concluded that I possessed full capacity to manage personal and business affairs. This does not mean you will never forget anything. She told me, competence is not perfection. Martin requested a signed report and an affidavit describing her independence from the family. I felt relief, but he cautioned that one report would not end the matter if Daniel claimed sudden danger. Courts move quickly when someone alleges exploitation or impaired judgment. He said, we need to prepare for him to act before the rest of the audit is complete. We revoked the financial power of attorney that afternoon. Martin sent certified notices to the bank, the company's lender, the brokerage firm, and every institution where Daniel might attempt to act in my name. Susan preserved the server records and changed administrative access so no files could be deleted. I removed Daniel's ability to approve new payments to Marlowe and Pine. But I did not terminate him as manager. Not yet. Martin wanted evidence of how Daniel responded when he believed control was slipping. I called my son that evening and deliberately sounded tired. I don't want this tearing everyone apart, I said. Daniel's voice softened immediately. Neither do I. Dad. I told him I was willing to discuss a leadership transition if he provided full financial records and agreed to a formal meeting with Martin and Susan. He was silent, then said, that's the responsible choice. The warmth in his tone made my stomach turn. He believed pressure had worked. And for the first time, I let him believe it. Daniel began speaking as though the outcome were settled. He emailed a proposed structure naming himself president and me founder emeritus. He suggested I retain an office but surrender signing authority, vendor approval, and operational voting control. He also proposed a 10-year preferred vendor agreement with Marlowe and Pine, describing it as essential to brand continuity. I responded with neutral questions and asked him to document the business justification. Each answer created another record. He claimed the event company had unique institutional knowledge, though it had worked with us for barely 14 months. He claimed lenders wanted younger leadership, but produced no lender correspondence. He said my reduced capacity required stability, even after I told him an independent doctor had cleared me. That detail changed his tone. He asked why I had sought testing without consulting him. Because it was my decision, I said. He called that secretive. I almost laughed. The man who had built a guardianship file in secret objected to my private medical evaluation because it contradicted the role he had assigned me. Marissa contacted Emily separately. She sent a long message saying she regretted the wording at Riverstone but insisted the family needed boundaries. She claimed Daniel had been under tremendous stress managing the properties while I recovered and suggested Emily's presence had made him fear being pushed aside. Emily showed me the message without replying. The apology contained no admission about the invoices, the stage dinner, or the guardianship preparation. It was an attempt to isolate a single cruel sentence from the larger plan. Still, one line revealed more than Marissa intended, Daniel said. Once the court recognized what everyone could already see, the company would finally be secure. Emily circled the phrase, the court. Marissa had written it casually, as if judicial involvement had been expected. Martin advised Emily to preserve the message and avoid confrontation. Let them keep explaining, he said. People who believe their motives are justified often document more than people who know they are lying. 2 days later, Daniel requested an emergency family meeting at my house. He arrived with Marissa and a leather folder. Owen remained in the car. Daniel said he had prepared documents that would allow the company to function while we resolved our disagreement. The first page was a temporary delegation of voting authority. The second appointed him sole manager. The third authorized Marlowe and Pines pending invoices. Sign these, and we can avoid lawyers, he said. I asked why Owen was outside. Marissa answered, he doesn't need to see this. I thought about how they had been willing to use his dinner but now wanted to shield him from the paperwork behind it. I told Daniel I would not sign anything without Martin. His expression changed from concern to disappointment. This is exactly what I mean, he said. You used to understand business. I closed the folder and handed it back. I understand enough not to surrender control to the person asking me to prove I deserve it. Daniel stood and began pacing, a habit he had as a teenager when cornered by facts. He said employees were frightened, vendors were confused, and lenders questioned whether I could provide continuity. I asked which lenders had contacted him. He named one bank. But when I requested the representative's name, he avoided answering. Marissa said Emily had poisoned me against them. Emily, who had remained silent near the doorway, finally said, you planned the restaurant scene before Dad knew about the bills. Daniel's head turned sharply. You accessed private emails, company emails. I said, on a company server. About company assets. For a second, genuine fear crossed his face. Then he recovered. You're misreading ordinary planning because you're angry. I asked whether the phrase enough that someone outside the family notices referred to ordinary planning. Daniel's jaw tightened. He gathered the folder and left without answering. Marissa followed. But before the door closed, she looked back at me with an expression I could not read, part fear, part resentment, and perhaps the first sign that she had not understood how much Daniel had recorded. That night, Martin called at 917. His voice was calm, which meant the news was serious. Daniel had filed an emergency petition for guardianship and temporary conservatorship in Franklin County Probate Court. He alleged that I had become paranoid, disrupted company operations, isolated myself under Emily's influence, and made reckless financial decisions by freezing accounts and threatening established vendors. He included the anesthesia video, photographs of my medications, statements from Marissa, and emails showing my suspension of payments. He also described the Riverstone incident as an angry public departure in which I refused responsibility for a family bill. The petition asked the court to appoint Daniel temporary conservator over my business interests until a full hearing could be held. Can he do that without notifying me? I asked. Martin said emergency petitions could be presented quickly when someone claimed assets were at immediate risk. He had already filed Dr. Mercer's preliminary letter, but the completed affidavit had not yet been entered. By morning, the court had declined to grant Daniel full temporary control, but it issued a limited preservation order until the emergency hearing. No major ownership transfer, manager removal, unusual distribution, or change in company control could occur. The order was designed to protect assets, yet it also prevented me from firing Daniel before the hearing. When the bank received notice of the dispute, it froze changes to authorized signers. A contractor payment was rejected. 2 tenants called asking whether the company was in receivership. Daniel sent employees a message saying the court had intervened to prevent further instability, carefully avoiding the fact that he had requested the intervention himself. Marissa forwarded the order to relatives as proof that their concerns were valid. I had entered the week as the majority owner of a stable company. By Friday afternoon, my authority was restricted. My reputation was under question, and my son was presenting the court's caution as confirmation that I could no longer be trusted. Martin came to the house with the official notice just before sunset. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, 72 hours away. We had Dr. Mercer's report, the Riverstone statement, the payment records, and the folder metadata, but Susan's full forensic audit was unfinished. Daniel's attorneys would argue that every investigation I ordered reflected escalating paranoia. They would say my attempt to revoke his authority endangered the business, and that Emily stood to benefit from turning me against him. I looked at the hearing date, then at Linda's photograph across the room. For the first time since the bill arrived, I felt something close to defeat. Daniel did not need to prove I was permanently incompetent in 3 days. He only needed to create enough doubt that the court would leave him in control while the case continued. Martin closed his briefcase and said, "From this moment forward, every word matters." I folded the notice carefully. My son had spent 6 months preparing to make me look incapable. I had 1 weekend to show the court what he was truly trying to protect. By Saturday morning, my dining room had become a war room without the shouting. Susan occupied one end of the table with 3 laptops. Martin worked through a stack of court filings, and Emily organized printed records into color-coded folders. I made coffee because it was the only task in the room that still felt ordinary. Martin's strategy was simple. We would not try to prove Daniel was evil. We would prove I was competent, show that his financial conflict existed before the alleged emergency, and demonstrate that his story changed depending on what gave him control. Dr. Mercer's signed affidavit arrived before noon. It described my judgment, memory, and understanding of the company in precise terms. No emotional testimony could match. Nathan also agreed to provide a statement about the Riverstone bill. Numbers, dates, independent witnesses. Martin said, "That's what the judge will trust." I looked at the folders spread across the table and realized Daniel had built his case from family memories. We were answering with records he could not reinterpret. Susan completed enough of the audit to establish a pattern, though not enough to trace every dollar. The $93,600 paid to Marlowe and Pine had been divided into 8 invoices, each below my approval threshold. 4 lacked contracts. 3 described events that no tenant could verify attending. 1 paid for succession communications before I had agreed to any succession at all. Susan also found that Daniel had temporarily changed the mailing address for several vendor statements from my office to his home. That explained why I had never seen overdue notices from Riverstone. "This wasn't bookkeeping sloppiness," she said. "It was information control." Martin asked her to avoid conclusions she could not support in court, but his expression told me the phrase mattered. Daniel did not merely want authority. He had been narrowing what I could see, then using my lack of knowledge as evidence that I no longer understood the company. The deeper Susan looked, the more the guardianship petition resembled a shield built around financial decisions Daniel knew I would challenge. On Saturday afternoon, I called Daniel and told him I wanted to settle before the hearing. I kept my voice tired and let long silences suggest defeat. "I don't want Owen watching us destroy each other," I said. Daniel answered gently, almost tenderly. "Neither do I, Dad. I've been trying to protect everyone." I proposed meeting Sunday evening at Riverstone, the same restaurant where the conflict began. I told him Martin could prepare a transition agreement, making Daniel president while I retained a ceremonial title. In exchange, Daniel would provide a complete accounting and sign a statement confirming that all payments to Marlowe and Pine served legitimate company purposes. He agreed too quickly. "That's all I've wanted," he said. We both knew it was not all he wanted. I chose Riverstone because Nathan could identify the account records, and because Daniel had already booked the leadership transition dinner there. If he believed I was surrendering, he might explain the invoices, the future contract, and the guardianship petition in his own words before independent witnesses. Emily hated the idea of letting Daniel think he had won. He filed against you, she said. Now you're inviting him to dinner. I told her a trap only worked when the other person saw what he expected to see. Daniel expected an old man frightened by court, ashamed by publicity, and desperate to preserve the family. None of those assumptions was entirely wrong, which made the performance easier. I was frightened. I was ashamed that employees and relatives questioned my mind. I did want to preserve something of the family. The difference was that I no longer confused preservation with surrender. Martin arranged for the meeting to take place in Riverstone's smaller conference room. Nathan would be nearby, and Susan would attend as company accountant. No secret recordings were necessary. Martin planned to present written acknowledgments and take contemporaneous notes. The goal is not a dramatic confession, he reminded us. The goal is to make Daniel choose between signing accurate statements and exposing that he cannot defend them. Before the meeting, Owen called me from a number I did not recognize. His voice was low, and I could hear traffic in the background. He said he was at a friend's house because he had argued with his parents. While using the family computer, he had found a message Daniel sent Marissa before the celebration. Make sure Grandpa is the one who looks unreasonable. Owen had taken a photograph of the screen before Daniel changed the password. Was my dinner really about getting evidence against you? He asked. I wished I could protect him with a softer answer. But lies had already done enough damage. Part of it was, I said. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he told me Daniel wanted him to sign a statement claiming I had seemed confused and angry at Riverstone. Owen refused because I had been calmer than anyone else at the table. Dad said Aunt Emily put me against him. He whispered. No one should ask you to choose. I said, especially not the people who created the choice. Owen sent the photograph to Martin. It supported the recovered email. But Martin warned that we should not build our case around a frightened 17-year-old. The message would be preserved. Yet Owen would testify only if necessary. When Daniel learned his son had left the house, he called Emily and accused her of arranging it. She put the call on speaker. You've spent months turning Dad against us, Daniel said. Emily answered. You filed a guardianship petition before he knew there was a fight. Daniel claimed the petition was responsible planning. When Emily mentioned the invoices, his tone hardened. You don't understand how businesses work. I understand that your wife's birthday wasn't tenant relations. He hung up. An hour later, Marissa called me privately. She sounded less certain than before. She asked whether Daniel had truly drafted the petition 6 months earlier. I told her the metadata would be presented in court. She whispered, he said the legal paperwork started after you froze the card. For the first time, she seemed to understand Daniel had also managed the information reaching her. The meeting at Riverstone began at 6 on Sunday evening. Daniel wore a dark suit and carried the same leather folder he had brought to my house. Marissa sat beside him but avoided my eyes. Martin placed a proposed transition memorandum on the table. It gave Daniel the title of president but required independent financial controls, complete disclosure of related party transactions, and repayment of any personal expenses. Daniel read the first page and frowned. This isn't a transition, it's an investigation. Martin replied that no responsible transition occurred without an accounting. Susan then presented a statement listing each Marlowe and Pine invoice and asked Daniel to identify the business purpose, attendees, and supporting contract. He answered broadly at first, calling the events relationship development. When Susan requested names, he became irritated. Marissa tried to explain that modern branding produced intangible value. I asked whether my company should have financed her birthday dinner. She said a leasing broker attended. Nathan entered quietly and confirmed the reservation had been made as a private birthday event, with no corporate notes, until Daniel changed the billing classification afterward. Daniel's confidence faltered, but only briefly. He pushed the statement aside and said the hearing was no longer negotiable because my advisors had manipulated me. You brought me here pretending you wanted peace, he said. I brought you here offering a way to explain your signatures, I replied. He stood and accused Susan of breaching confidentiality, Martin of encouraging family conflict, and Emily of positioning herself to inherit everything. I did not defend anyone. Instead, I asked a single question. Did you tell Marissa the guardianship petition was drafted 6 months ago? Marissa turned toward him before he answered. Daniel said preliminary planning was normal. She asked why he had told her the filing began only after I froze the account. He said she misunderstood. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but it changed the room. Until then, Marissa and Daniel had presented one story. Now their timelines separated in front of Nathan, Susan, Martin, and me. Daniel closed his folder and announced that further discussion would happen through counsel. As he headed for the door, Martin asked him to take a copy of the proposed acknowledgement. Daniel refused. Marissa remained seated for several seconds after he left. She stared at the invoice list and asked Susan whether Marlowe and Pine could be forced to repay everything. Susan said repayment would depend on documentation, value received, and any civil agreement. Marissa swallowed and said several events had been real, though not all were for Lawson tenants. Daniel said Dad had approved broad promotional spending. She murmured. I corrected her gently. You were at my house when he asked me to authorize the pending invoices. You knew approval had not been given. She closed her eyes. Understanding her fear did not mean allowing her to rewrite her role. She had made choices because those choices protected her company and lifestyle. Daniel's lies might explain why she entered the plan, but they did not erase what she did after seeing the harm. Marissa left alone, carrying no folder and making no promise to help us. Daniel's counterattack began before we reached home. He sent an email to company employees claiming I had staged an ambush meeting while under the influence of advisors seeking control of family assets. He attached a short video from Riverstone showing me seated at the table while Martin and Susan presented documents. Without context, it looked formal and confrontational. Marissa then posted the original clip of me leaving Owen's dinner, edited to remove the moment I paid for Emily and myself. Relatives began sharing it. A vendor emailed to say he was uncomfortable continuing work until the ownership dispute was resolved. Emily received a call from her school principal after a parent saw Marissa's post and accused her of exploiting an elderly father. She returned from the call pale and furious. Let me release the bills, she said. Let everyone see what they did. I refused. A public argument would reward Daniel by turning evidence into competing narratives. We answer in court, I said, not in comment sections. The damage still spread. The bank temporarily required dual confirmation for outgoing payments. A maintenance project at one property stalled because the contractor feared invoices would not be honored. Our operations manager, Carla Mendoza, called me and asked whether employees should prepare for layoffs. I told her the properties remained profitable and payroll was secure. She hesitated, then admitted Daniel had informed managers for months that I was declining and would soon be removed from daily involvement. He made it sound medically decided, she said. Martin requested a written statement describing those communications. Carla agreed, though reluctantly, because Daniel had supervised her for 7 years. Her discomfort reminded me that family betrayals rarely remain inside the family. Employees, tenants, vendors, and even school colleagues had been pulled into a struggle they did not create. Daniel had counted on that spread. The more people heard I was declining, the more natural his leadership would appear. Reputation, once circulated as concern, became difficult to separate from fact. Late Sunday night, Owen arrived at my house with Emily. He had retrieved clothes from home while his parents were out and planned to stay with a teammate's family. He looked exhausted and older than he had at dinner. Mom says you're trying to ruin her company, he told me. Are you? I said I was trying to recover money that should not have been used without authorization, and that legitimate services would be evaluated fairly. He asked whether his parents would go to jail. I told him the guardianship hearing was not a criminal case and that I wanted accountability, not destruction. Then why does Dad act like losing control means losing everything he asked? I had no answer that would not indict my son's character. Instead, I told Owen his father had tied his identity too tightly to being the next man in charge. When power becomes proof of worth, surrendering it feels like disappearing. Owen looked at Linda's photograph and said, Grandma wouldn't recognize us. I thought she might recognize us too well. At midnight, Martin called with one final complication. Daniel's attorneys had filed a motion questioning whether Susan lawfully accessed the senior transition folder and asking the court to exclude emails recovered from the company server. They argued the files contained privileged legal preparation and private medical material. Martin expected the judge to reserve judgment, which meant some of our most revealing communications might not be available during the emergency hearing. We adjusted immediately. The case would rest first on evidence no one could challenge. Dr. Mercer's independent evaluation, official payment records, signed invoices, the Riverstone account statement, the reservation for the transition dinner, the timing of the consulting payment, Carla's statement, and the draft guardianship petition Daniel himself filed. The emails would support motive only if admitted. He's trying to take away the most dramatic evidence, Emily said. Martin nodded. Then we win without drama. That sentence steadied me more than any promise could have. Daniel had spent months manufacturing impressions. We would present a sequence of verifiable acts. I slept for perhaps 3 hours. At down. I dressed in the charcoal suit Linda once said made me look more honest than I deserved. I placed Dr. Mercer's report, the restaurant statement, and the transition reservation into my briefcase. Emily offered to drive, but I chose to take the wheel. Competence should not be performed for strangers. Yet that morning, every ordinary decision carried symbolic weight. Franklin County Probate Court stood under a colorless sky. Its stone entrance, busy with attorneys and families carrying their private grief in public folders. Daniel and Marissa were already inside. They sat together, though a visible space separated their shoulders. Daniel's attorney spoke to him while Marissa stared at the floor. Nathan waited near the back with Susan and Carla. Owen was not present. Martin had persuaded him to attend school unless called. As I entered the courtroom, Daniel looked at me with the calm expression he had learned from watching me negotiate. For one painful moment, I saw myself in him. The clerk called our case, and everyone rose. Daniel's petition lay on one table, describing me as confused, isolated, and dangerous to the assets I had built. On the other table sat proof that I knew exactly what I owned, exactly what had been spent, and exactly why my son needed me declared incapable. Martin leaned toward me and whispered, "Do not argue with their version emotionally. Let the timeline do the work." I nodded. Across the aisle, Daniel opened his leather folder and removed the anesthesia video transcript. Marissa glanced toward me, then toward the stack of invoices Susan carried. The judge entered, and the room became silent. I understood then that the final confrontation would not be about who loved whom, or who had sacrificed more, or who could tell the saddest story. It would be about signatures, dates, money, and whether concern for an aging father had begun before or after his son needed protection from an audit. The judge looked down at the petition and said, "Mr. Lawson, let us begin." Daniel's attorney began by presenting him as a reluctant son forced into an impossible position. He described a respected businessman whose judgment had recently become inconsistent, whose decisions threatened employees and tenants, and whose daughter had isolated him after moving into his home. The anesthesia video played on a courtroom monitor. In it, I blinked beneath fluorescent hospital lights, misidentified the year, and laughed when Daniel asked whether I knew where I was. Without the smell of antiseptic, the medication chart, or the nurse explaining that I had awakened minutes earlier. The clip looked disturbing. Marissa testified that I had become suspicious, controlling, and hostile. She described the Riverstone dinner as a simple celebration that ended when I refused to accept a reasonable boundary and abandoned the table. Daniel watched the judge with a solemn expression, not triumphant, almost grieving. He understood that the strongest lie is often delivered as a burden the liar wishes he did not have to carry. His attorney then listed the financial decisions I had made after the dinner, freezing a corporate card, halting payments to an established vendor, revoking Daniel's authority, and initiating an audit without consulting the manager responsible for daily operations. Each action was real. The interpretation was not. He argued that my sudden distrust had disrupted contractor payments and alarmed lenders. He displayed emails from vendors asking who controlled the company, and a notice from the bank requiring temporary dual confirmation. "The petitioner is not seeking his father's wealth," he said. He is seeking stability for assets that support employees. To know, and 3 generations of this family. When Daniel took the stand, he spoke about joining me after college, learning the properties, and carrying more responsibility during my surgeries. He said filing the petition had been the most painful decision of his life. I love my father, he told the judge, but loving someone sometimes means protecting them from decisions they no longer understand. Martin did not challenge Daniel's love. He asked dates. When had Daniel first believed I was incapable of managing my affairs, Daniel said, concerns developed gradually. When had he contacted the guardianship consulting firm? Daniel hesitated, then admitted it was 6 months earlier. Had I experienced a medical crisis at that time? No. Had I missed mortgage payments, tax deadlines, or lease obligations? No. Had any doctor diagnosed cognitive impairment? No. Martin then asked why Lawson Property Group paid the consultant rather than Daniel personally. Daniel said the advice concerned management continuity. So the company paid for a legal strategy that could place you in control of your father's ownership interest? Martin asked. Daniel objected to the wording, but the question remained in the room. When shown the consultant's invoice labeled management continuity, he acknowledged approving it. The judge wrote something in her notes. Daniel's expression did not change, but his right hand tightened around the edge of the witness stand. Dr. Mercer testified next. She explained that confusion immediately after anesthesia and short-term memory lapses during opioid treatment did not establish incapacity. She described the difference between occasional forgetfulness and an inability to understand decisions. Her evaluation had tested memory, reasoning, judgment, numerical ability, and appreciation of consequences. I had explained the LLC structure, described my estate plan, calculated ownership percentages, and identified the risks of changing management during a dispute. Mr. Lawson demonstrated full decision-making capacity, she said. Daniel's attorney asked whether one examination could guarantee I would never decline. Dr. Mercer answered that no examination could guarantee anyone's future health. The court is evaluating his present capacity, she said, not whether aging might affect him someday. That answer stripped fear away from the evidence. Daniel's case depended on turning age into a verdict before age had actually taken anything from me. For the first time that morning, I saw Marissa look directly at Daniel rather than at the judge. Nathan's testimony dismantled the Riverstone story with almost embarrassing simplicity. He confirmed that I had paid for my meal and Emily's before leaving. He produced the signed receipt and timestamp. He explained that Marissa had requested the rest of the dinner be charged to Lawson Property Group, including the wine, private room, and meals of personal guests. The balance statement showed $18,426 in accumulated charges, many connected to family events. Daniel's attorney tried to characterize them as legitimate relationship-building expenses, but Nathan produced original reservation notes. Marissa's birthday dinner had been booked as a private celebration. Their anniversary dinner listed no corporate purpose. The classifications changed only when Daniel directed accounting to place them on the business account. Nathan also identified the leadership transition dinner reservation, scheduled before I had approved any transition. The printed sign requested for the event read, "The Next Generation." The judge examined the document, then asked Daniel whether he had planned to announce new leadership without the majority owner's consent. He answered, "I believed consent had already been given." Susan's testimony dealt in numbers, and numbers gave Daniel nowhere comfortable to hide. She presented the 8 payments to Marlowe and Pine, totaling $93,600. She showed how each invoice fell below the $25,000 approval threshold, and how several lacked contracts, attendee lists, or deliverables. She did not accuse anyone of theft. She explained ordinary accounting controls and how related party transactions should be disclosed. Daniel had approved payments to his wife's company without competitive bids or written acknowledgement from me. 4 payments occurred shortly before significant debts were paid by Marlowe and Pine or Daniel's household. Susan carefully stated that timing alone did not prove the destination of funds, but it established a reason for independent review. When Daniel's attorney accused her of siding with me, she answered, "I am siding with documentation." Martin then asked whether my decision to suspend payments was financially irrational. "No," Susan said, "given the records available. Continuing them without review would have been irresponsible. The court permitted limited use of the senior transition metadata, but reserved judgment on privileged content. Martin did not need the dramatic emails. He displayed the creation dates of the folder, the consultant invoice, the draft agenda, and the guardianship petition Daniel eventually filed. The folder began 6 months before the Riverstone dispute. The transition dinner was planned before Daniel claimed my account freeze created an emergency. The petition already contained the anesthesia incident, medication photographs, and allegations about Emily. Martin arranged the dates on a single timeline. Daniel's concern had not followed my supposedly irrational decisions. His preparations had preceded them. The petitioner argues that the audit proves decline, Martin said, but the evidence shows he was preparing to remove Mr. Lawson before Mr. Lawson discovered the payments that required an audit. Daniel's attorney objected that preparation could reflect prudent concern. The judge allowed the argument, but asked one question herself. Why was the majority owner not told that succession and guardianship planning were being funded through his own company? Marissa was recalled after Susan's testimony. Her confidence had weakened. Martin asked whether she believed I had approved every Marlowe and Pine invoice. She said Daniel told her he had broad authority. Martin showed her the documents Daniel brought to my house seeking retroactive approval of pending invoices. If authority already existed, why did he need this signature, he asked. Marissa stared at the page. She admitted she knew some events were personal but believed their attendees created business value. Martin asked whether she had been instructed to exclude Emily's meal at Riverstone. Daniel's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the question because the dinner had been presented as evidence of my behavior. Marissa looked toward Daniel. He did not look back. Daniel said Emily's presence made Rick defensive. She answered. He thought a clear boundary might reveal how Rick reacted. Martin asked whether Daniel used the phrase make him look unreasonable. Marissa closed her eyes briefly. Yes. The courtroom remained silent long enough for the answer to settle without embellishment. When I took the stand, Martin first asked me to describe Lawson Property Group. I explained the 4 retail properties, the ownership percentages, the outstanding loans, measure tenor, and operating reserves. I described why halting undocumented related party payments protected rather than endangered the company. Then he asked why I had granted Daniel so much authority. Because he was my son, I said, and because I wanted trust to do the work that controls should have done. I admitted my mistakes without softening them. I had failed to revoke the power of attorney after recovery. I had ignored Susan's suggestion for conflict disclosures. I had hidden financial help to Emily and delegated power to Daniel without explaining either arrangement openly. I had avoided family conflict until avoidance became permission. My son did not create every weakness in our family, I said, but he chose to use those weaknesses to gain control rather than tell me the truth about the money. Daniel's attorney asked whether I was angry. Yes, I answered. He asked whether anger influenced my decision to remove Daniel. Evidence influenced it. Anger made the evidence painful. He suggested Emily expected to inherit more if Daniel lost his position. I explained that my will still included both children and that ownership inheritance was separate from management authority. He asked whether I wanted to punish Daniel for insulting his sister. No, I said. Marissa insulted Emily. Daniel watched. That showed me something about our family. But it did not justify a financial audit. The bills justified the audit. The invoices justified the suspension. The guardianship filing justified my concern about control. Finally, he asked whether I believed Daniel loved me. I looked at my son before answering. I believe he does. I also believe he became convinced that loving me entitled him to replace my judgment with his own. Those beliefs can exist together. One does not excuse the other. The judge recessed for 40 minutes. We waited in the hallway beneath lights that made everyone look tired. Emily sat beside me without speaking. Susan reviewed figures she no longer needed to review. Nathan left for the restaurant. Across the corridor, Daniel and Marissa argued in whispers. I could not hear every word. But I heard Marissa say, "You told me it started after the card." Daniel answered that timing did not matter. To her, it clearly did. Owen arrived with his school counselor shortly before the court reconvened. Martin had not called him, but he wanted to be present. Daniel saw his son and stepped forward. Owen moved beside Emily instead. The gesture was small, but Daniel stopped as if he had struck a wall. I felt no satisfaction. A father losing his son's trust is not a victory. Even when the loss is self-inflicted, it is simply another cost added to a bill no one can fully repay. The judge denied the emergency guardianship petition. She found no credible evidence that I lacked capacity, and substantial evidence that Daniel's financial interests conflicted with the control he sought. She dissolved the preservation order and restored my authority over Lawson Property Group. She did not rule that every Marlowe and Pine payment was fraudulent, because that question required a separate accounting process. She did state that related party transactions, undisclosed succession planning, and the use of company funds for guardianship preparation raised serious fiduciary concerns. The judge declined to appoint Daniel in any protective role and ordered preservation of business records while the civil accounting proceeded. Her language was restrained, but its effect was immediate. Daniel had built his claim around being the responsible successor. The court had found that his desire for control made him unsuitable to receive it. As the clerk collected the files, Daniel remained seated, staring at the table where his petition lay closed. That afternoon, I convened a properly noticed meeting of Lawson Property Group. With my 80% voting interest, I removed Daniel as manager for undisclosed conflicts, unauthorized related party transactions, and loss of trust. I appointed an independent property management firm and established dual approval for payments above $10,000. Susan received authority to complete the forensic audit, and Martin notified the banks and vendors that normal operations had resumed. I did not eliminate Daniel's 10% ownership interest. Taking what already belonged to him would have turned accountability into revenge. Instead, we negotiated a civil settlement after the audit identified personal and unsupported expenses. Daniel and Marissa agreed to repay a substantial portion through cash, the sale of assets, and a security interest in Daniel's LLC distributions. His ownership payments would first satisfy the obligation. Marlowe and Pine lost its preferred vendor relationship and reduced staff. Marissa sold the downtown studio and later their oversized house. The consequences were severe, but they matched choices rather than anger. Daniel did not apologize during the settlement. He called the outcome excessive and said I had chosen outsiders over family. I told him the outsiders had used rules because family had stopped respecting boundaries. Marissa apologized to Emily several weeks later in my kitchen. It was not a graceful apology. She admitted the restaurant insult was planned, acknowledged that she knew some invoices were personal, and confessed that fear of losing her business had made every compromise feel temporary. Emily listened, without rescuing her from discomfort. I believe you're sorry now, she said. Trust will depend on what you do after being sorry. Owen returned home after Daniel agreed to stop asking him for statements and counseling began. I paid Owen's tuition directly to the university, not through his parents. He remained close to me, though I made certain he never became a messenger between adults. Children should not be promoted to witness simply because their parents have forgotten how to tell the truth. I revised my estate plan with Martin. Emily did not receive control of everything, and Daniel was not erased. Both children remained beneficiaries, but Daniel's future inheritance would be held in an independent trust, with no authority over Lawson Property Group operations. The properties would eventually be managed professionally or sold, according to conditions established while I remained competent. I also gave Emily access to the records, not because she had earned more money through loyalty, but because secrecy had caused enough damage. She found a new apartment after the insurance settlement, though she visited often and continued driving me to therapy until I could manage alone. Our relationship became less dependent and more honest. I learned to let her pay for coffee. She learned to disagree without expecting me to choose peace over her dignity. We did not pretend the court decision healed the family. It simply removed the legal weapon from the wound. 3 months after the hearing, Emily and I returned to Riverstone to thank Nathan. We sat at a small table near the windows instead of in a private room. No one ordered expensive wine. Emily chose the salmon again. And I ordered meatloaf because 70 years had taught me that restaurants often improve simple food by charging more for it. When the check arrived, I reached for it automatically. Emily placed her hand over the folder. We split it, she said. My first instinct was to object. Paying had always been how I expressed care, but it had also become how I avoided equality, discomfort, and limits. Let go. We divided the bill exactly in half. Before leaving, I folded my receipt and placed it in my wallet beside the photograph of Linda. It was only a small restaurant bill, nothing like the statement that had exposed my son's plan. Still, I kept it as a reminder that respect is not measured by who pays. It is measured by whether anyone at the table is treated as though they do not belong.